Good morning, good evening, and good night, wherever you are joining us from around the world. I hope you've had a great day or are having a great day. Thank you for joining us to explore the spectrum of Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon and the diversity of our region's most sought-after wine variety. My name is Connor Best, and I work with the Napa Valley Vintners, an association of more than 550 wineries in our region, banded together to promote, protect, and enhance the Napa Valley. I apologize to you for the postponement a few weeks ago. 2020 has certainly been quite a year for everyone, not least the millions across California who have faced wildfires over the past few weeks. We thank the firefighters and the first responders who have protected our homes, communities, and vineyards and wineries. You're heroes. Thank you. But life, and in our case, harvest, rolls on, and so does your desire to learn about Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. If you want to access additional sessions like this, go to our website, napavintners.com, and find the Napa Sessions link where you can access past recordings and upcoming masterclasses. Before I introduce our host, I'd like to draw your attention to an opportunity for you to procure literally hundreds of current and pre-release Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignons. If you haven't done so already, go to napavintners.com, click the Open the Cellar link, and browse the selection. Our host today literally needs no introduction. After all, he has a Wikipedia page. But for those of you who are not already following him, I'll get you up to speed. Alder Yarrow is an American wine and restaurant blogger, and since 2004 has published Vinography, one of the internet's most highly rated wine blogs. Since 2011, Alder has written a column for European wine critic Jancis Robinson's website. Alder left his day job earlier this year in the design industry to focus full-time on wine writing, and he is no stranger to the Napa Valley. So Alder, thank you for leading our discussion today, and I turn it over to you.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you, Connor. Who doesn't love tasting Cabernet at 10 a.m.? At least that's what time it is here where we are in California. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Vintners, for joining me for what I hope is a really interesting and engaging conversation this morning. For everybody watching, let me do a quick introduction of my panelists that we're going to be speaking with today and talk a little bit about sort of my expectations for the session. So I'm joined today by Allison Rodriguez. Wave, Allison. Your name's down there so everybody can see who she is. She's the winemaker at the Hess Collection. We've got Jonathan Pei, the founder and the winemaker at Textbook. We've got Beth Novak-Milliken, the president and CEO of Spottswoode Estate. We've got Priyanka French, who is the winemaker and wine growing director at Signorello Estate. And we've got Riley Keenan, who is the second generation vintner at Keenan Winery and third generation of Keenans living on Spring Mountain and making wine there. Thank you all very much for coming. And today's conversation is about diversity in Napa. And it's pretty easy to think of Napa as this big monolithic place. Certainly for your average consumer, which I don't expect to have too many on today's conversation, people think of Napa, they think of Cabernet, they think of red wine, and that's about it. But anybody who digs just below the surface of Napa can understand that there's an awful lot of diversity here. There's, after all, 16 different sub-AVA regions within Napa, and there's a reason for their existence. But even beyond that diversity within the valley, we have the diversity of individual sites. And we're going to be talking to a certain extent about both the AVAs today and the individual sites. Of course, it's difficult in a 5-person webinar for just an hour to even truly, scratch the surface of what the diversity of Napa is. But we're going to just take, 5 little snapshots with the conversations that we're going to have today with these vintners and talk about 5 special places within Napa and the wines that they produce. So thanks for coming along for the ride. I encourage everybody to use the Q&A function down there at the bottom of your Zoom bar, as well as the chat if you like. To ask questions as we go along. What I'll do is I'll probably go through and ask a few questions of my panelists. We'll taste their wines as we hear about the individual sites. And then we'll go into a little bit more of a discussion as we go along. But to the extent that you, the audience, have questions for individual vintners or for me as we go along, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll attempt to get them answered sort of midstream as we go. All right, so let's get started because, let's drink wine. So let's start with Signorello. Priyanka, pull yourself off mute there, and let's talk a little bit about this wine that we're drinking here today, the 2016 Padron. But in particular, let's talk about the Signorello site. You sit sort of a little bit apart from many of your neighbors down in the southern part of the valley, the edge of the Oak Knoll district. Tell us a little bit about the Signorello estate, the soils, what the microclimate's like there, what's special about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today, Alder. And what a great company to kick off, the work week after Labor Day, though it's been work week all day with harvest. But very excited to be here today. Signorello Estate, as you mentioned, is on the southern end of Napa Valley. We are located right off of the Silverado Trail. And so most people that drive down Silverado Trail know where the property is. We have some very well-known neighbors around us, and the vineyards span that front end of the property as well. So something that most people have driven past. It's a really exciting property for us because if you really look at this southern side of Napa, this is really the only hillside estate, if you will, with vineyards having a little bit of an elevation. The highest elevation that we hit on the property is 400 feet above sea level. And when we came, I've only recently joined. I've been here since 2019. And unfortunately, with the 17 fires, we did lose a lot of the previous information we had about the history of the estate. So in a way, it was very exciting because we were almost starting from scratch. So we did a lot of data collection in 2019 in terms of soil analysis and just understanding and recording what we're observing in the vineyard. And one of the key things that we actually found that for me right away explains so many things about Signorello and the wines that have been created is the fact that the soil series allocates us as a hambrite clay soil, which is kind of that more alluvial soil that you find closer to the Napa River, which is right across Silverado Trail from us. But the property in itself actually has hambrite loam along with volcanic rock outcropping. So that terroir or geology is very well mimicked in Pritchard Hill and kind of further up in the Vaca Mountains. So our theory or hypothesis at this point that we're trying to really see if we can create a solid just a solid information for it is that we think at some point this broke away from the Vaca Mountains. And the minute we kind of gained that information, a lot of the other things about the property made sense. It is an early ripening site. We find that key physiological features like bud break, veraison, berry stat tend to happen earlier than a lot of our neighbors. The soils lead to very characteristic acids and pH that I think are reflected in the Signorello wines as well. But what's really unique is the fact that we're in a state vineyard, but we actually farm two very separate vineyards. So as I mentioned, we're on the hillside, and the front side faces the west. So we get a lot of solar radiation, a lot of heat, a lot of exposure because of that aspect. Whereas our back vineyards are eastern facing. And so the direction that we're going in on both sides is absolutely different. On the front end, we're looking to really shade the fruit and protect it and preserve all of the delicate nuances that we get with our big, bold cabs. And in the back, we're almost trying to open out the canopy and let more air in, let more light in. And because of that, I think we see a really great balance where we have concentration and structure and the power of tannins, but a very delicate herbal and kind of more floral notes that you would see in the cooler climate cabs because of our eastern side. And I feel like that balance is really well reflected in the 2016 Padron that we're drinking today. So this one is 91% Cab and 9% Merlot. Padron is our flagship Cabernet Sauvignon. It was named after Ray Sr., who is the founder and proprietor of the property. His nickname was Padrone because he was, a big Italian man, larger than life personality. And when he passed in the early 2000s, the flagship Cabernet got kind of named in his honor. So for me, what's exciting about the Padrone is that it almost always ends up being close to a 50-50 blend of this front and back section of our vineyard that we saw. There's a lot of structure, but the tannins are very well worked. That is definitely our biggest challenge, is how to tame the tannins that we get off of this property. And I find that the addition of that Merlot gives it that little more silkiness, a little more softness to it. You can see that fruit going into that herbal and floral characters as you kind of lean into the wine further on into the finish. So really exciting wine for us to be sharing with you all today.
Yeah, thank you. It's delicious. As one of the more southerly vineyards in this region, or at least that we're talking about today, how much marine influence do you get? How much do you get up off the bay, the morning fog?
Quite a bit, actually. I would say, I've worked in St. Helena and Oakville, so definitely the warmer northern side of the valley, and to come here and realize how much more moderate our extremes tend to be. Mm-hmm. So, even during a heat wave, for example, we definitely do see just a more moderate transition from daytime temperatures into nighttime temperatures. The winters tend to be a little colder. Even in the summertime, we won't hit those high temperatures till much later in the day. So a little more protected from that marine layer side compared to in valley for sure.
Super. Thanks very much. It's
Thank
a
you.
lovely wine. Let's move a little bit north now and go to Oakville and talk with Jonathan about the textbook line. And so Jonathan, textbook has been made since you founded it from an Oakville vineyard in 2004. Would you talk a little bit about where it is situated in Oakville? Maybe use Mondavi as the sort of as a landmark that many people know. Tell us a little bit about the vineyard, and tell us a little bit about the characteristics that led you to Oakville to begin with.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks. We started, our first vintage was 2004, and my late wife and I founded the wine in that year. And we had both lived and worked in Italy and France. My family's been in France for over 4 decades. And, we had the great luxury of kind of, exploring Napa. I'd worked in Napa already by then for 20 years. And, we kept coming back to some of our favorite wines were from Oakville. They have this amazing sort of plush fruit, but also really high quality tannins. And so we selected a site, and we're working with 2 families there. On the east side, right off Silverado Trail, is a site, the Borney family farms it. And it's just crazy site because I guess in the 1940s or so, when they were building or rebuilding Rector Creek, they scraped 40 to 50 feet of topsoil off of this huge area of land there and moved it up onto Rector Creek. And what that exposed was this ancient riverbed, just pure gravel and stones. And that's where the vineyard is planted. So I brought a piece of it here today, but I mean, it's just this sort of stuff. And it's quite remarkable. Having lived in France and worked in Bordeaux, of course, one thinks of Graves and things like that. And that's kind of what drew us there. If you look at the Oakville appellation, it was founded in 1993, it's about 27 years ago. In terms of size for our audience, if you think of Pauillac is about 3,000 acres, okay? Margaux is about a little more than that, about 3,000 acres, and Oakville is about 5,000 acres. So these are very, very small appellations. But for Cabernet, we feel that we're in a great neighborhood. For a textbook Merlot, we're completely on the other side of the valley. We work with a great family named Laura Holmes, and that is pushed up against the Mayacamas Hills. Soil there is completely different. It's more loamy. It's a little more clay to it. It's superb for Merlot. And so we've been working there since 2004 and super happy with the result. That's great.
That's great. You, as a vintner, have historically sort of aimed for a slightly earlier picked, sort of more claret, lighter weight style wine. Is there something about Oakville that lent itself to that style? Was that a place you chose because of that desire?
Yeah, thanks. I think, I'm trying to make delicious Oakville wines, delicious Napa Valley wines, there's no question. But sometimes I feel like I've got this little French guy on my shoulder saying, John, it is time to pick a little bit earlier. And so I'm looking for wines a little more balanced, a little more elegance. And I think it's simply because of where I cut my teeth. I grew up drinking French wines. since 15 years old. And, I like a little more lift, as the British say to it. And I think with Oakville, both soil and climate, it gives you a lot of flavor early on in the ripeness spectrum. And we really, as a style for our family, we were trying to avoid that sort of pruniness that if it gets overripe, just really, really wanted to stay away from that. So yeah, we tend to be picking a little bit earlier than some of our neighbors, trying to have a little more balance to it. We still want concentration, we want this plush fruit, but just a little more balance to it. So.
Yeah, super. Thanks so much. Let's bounce up the valley a little bit more to St. Helena and talk with Beth from Spottswoode. So you're on the northwest side of town, sort of just underneath Spring Mountain, but also valley floor like Oakville, and so I think it's useful to sort of compare and contrast a bit. 6 miles farther north, the valley where you are in St. Helena is much narrower than it is in the Oakville universe. And so tell me a little bit about the soil and the climate, and if you can, Beth, compare and contrast it to what you know of Oakville, and how might St. Helena be thought of as a different spot. And don't forget to pull yourself off mute, Beth.
Sorry, I'm out of practice. Just dropped our youngest son off in Walla Walla, and I haven't been on a Zoom meeting for about 10 days. So sorry about that. So we're up on the northernmost part of the western benchland of Napa Valley. So as you noted, Alder, we're at the base of the Mayacamas and Spring Mountain. Once you head, sort of north of us, well, west of us, of course, you hit Keenan, but as you head further north of us, you just bump right into Spring Mountain. So we're this benchland, alluvial soils right up against the western hills. So we're actually in the city limits of St. Helena. We have 45 acres here. And even though we have one contiguous 40-acre sort of planted site, if you will, or 37.5 planted acres, each part of it is different. The part up back against the Mayacamas is a lot more rocky, kind of bigger cobbles, definitely the alluvium that came down early, and of course the heavier, the bigger parts of those soil series settle up higher, and then as it keeps flowing down toward Napa River, which we're about a mile away from, you get the smaller soils. So we have, sort of cobbles, and we have clay loam. We have a lot of it's well-drained soil, and it's just by pure accident that my parents happened to buy this property in 1972, and we ended up with it because it was a lifestyle change. It was not a vision, shall we say. But it was lucky we moved here when land was low priced, and they by pure luck bought what has turned out to be a really great piece of ground. In terms of St. Helena and what we were just talking about, kind of to go what Priyanka was talking about, I mean, we're up here where we have bigger diurnal shifts in temperature, so we'll be hotter during the day, and then we'll generally be cooler at night, say, than some of the hillsides. There is a gap that sort of comes through the Mayacamas Gap, Spring Mountain, so we do get, in normal years, whatever that means anymore, we do get fog, and that nice morning fog, and that nice cooling, and that hydration. And then, of course, in the afternoon, in an ideal world, that burns off, and then you get that sunshine. At Spottswoode, what we've always tried to do, we moved here in '72, but made our first Cabernet Sauvignon in 1982. A few things happened in between. My father passed away, and then unexpectedly, and my mother got the winery going in 1982. And Tony Soter was our founding winemaker, and it was he who really looked to Bordeaux as a model, because that's really what we had to look at that time. We have always striven, I think that's the word, not strived, to make wines that honor our estate. So we've always tried to make well-balanced wines that we want to pick when the fruit is ripe, but not too ripe. So we pick anywhere between 22.5 to 24.5 is our goal, bringing in at a spectrum of different times. Each block, of which there are 24, is farmed independently. We are a combination of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Petit Verdot. And we don't have Merlot up here. It is too warm where we are. So in Oakville and other places, it can grow well. For us, it's just something that we had in our vineyard for a while, and it's a little bit too warm up here. So we are definitely, again, warmer up here, but we're on those alluvial soils. They're well drained. Yeah, we have those big cobbles, and it's just a really interesting, it's an interesting site.
Does the sun come off it sooner than some of your neighbors there, maybe who might be on the east side of St. Helena because of the shadow of the mountains? And does that
It,
affect at all?
it would come off of us sooner, certainly, than the east side. And then the other things is that the way that our vines or our roads are oriented, first of all, we're big believers in trellising. We've always had sort of this wide trellis, and Tony brought that on board. We never went to this sort of vertical trellis. It's a Y that opens up in the middle and allows for shading. And on what I'll call the sun side, or the west side, if you will, of the vines, we've employed a lot of shade cloth over the last 12 years. So basically, right after veraison, we put shade cloth up on that one side of the vine, and we'll keep it up there through harvest to try to help us let that afternoon sun not quite so directly hit the fruit. We also don't leaf a great deal, if any. So we want to make sure that we keep those leaves in there to give shade to our vines and to the fruit on them. And then we do just in full disclosure, and I think most everybody here probably does, we do irrigate. And we have, over the years, we irrigate probably for the last 15 years, because climate change has been very apparent to us. And if you are in the world of farming, it is obvious. Our irrigations are longer and deeper, so we're looking to send water further down and to send our roots further down after it, and to just allow our plants to make it through some of these extremes, because although we have higher diurnal with climate change, we do have more extremes. And one final thing, we've been farming organically since 1985. So thanks to Tony Soter, we were the first in Napa Valley to start farming organically, just because, and I say thanks to Tony because it was his idea. And he was interested in it. My mother was willing to support him. And we've been biodynamic since basically started farming in 2006 biodynamically as well. So we feel like with that, we have some resilience built into our vineyard that is allowing it to make it through some of these, more unusual events that we're having here now.
Yeah. So I want to pause here just for a second, and we'll get to Riley and to Allison here in a moment. They to a certain extent represent the hillsides, and so I want to take a pause here now that we've sort of jumped across the valley floor in 3 different places, and just comment on, and feel free to chime in here, panelists, on just the differences between these 3 wines. For starters, there clearly is a difference between these 3 wines. They each have their own unique texture. In particular, I think the quality of the tannins in each of these wines is different and distinct. Slightly different acid profiles within each of the wines. But very much, not monolithic in their expression of Napa Cabernet by any means. Panelists, do you have any thoughts on these wines?
For me, I think these 3 wines really kind of show you the differences just as you move further into the valley. Spottswoode is, one of my favorite wineries, because they just have a balance but a generosity to the wines, and there's just such a breadth in terms of the fruit that is expressed that this wine is showing so beautifully. But in textbook, you see that richness that Oakville is known for. You see just the depth in the wine, and you see a lot of that, just the Oakville, like blueberry, a lot of those bluer fruit characters for me. And so I think that these 3 wines are, to have this one compared next to textbook and Spottswoode it's been a fascinating flight.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anybody else have anything other to add?
I think it's really interesting to look at the quality of the fruit. There's great fruit purity in each of these wines, and they really seem, to me anyway, to speak to the places that they're made. You kind of have like this really, to me, it was a very bright, sort of clear cherry coming from the textbook. Just kind of a gorgeous ringing fruit. And then the Spottswoode, to me, seems a little bit darker in profile, more of I think of Italian plum, and these really dark purple, foresty, dense characters of the fruit. And then I'm also really impressed with the Signorello, this gorgeous sort of brighter red currant and Bing cherry. And to me, you kind of look at those qualities of fruit as you go up the valley, and you kind of progressively go a little bit warmer. I'd be curious to hear if the winemakers think that that's what's making the impact, or if it's probably, as with everything, so many different factors that come into play. But I find them very diverse and fascinating.
Yeah, Alder, I think it'd be interesting to know on the both the Spottswoode and the Signorello what the percentage of non-Cabernet is in those. For the textbook Oakville, it's about 10% Merlot. But I'd love to hear from Priyanka and from Beth, what's making up our blends here.
So the Signorello Padrone is 9% Merlot, and the remainder is Cab, 91% Cab.
Similar to the textbook.
And the Spottswoode 17 is in about 89% Cabernet Sauvignon, about 7 or 8% Cab Franc, and the remainder is Petit Verdot.
The blend, the fact that it's a blend comes across most distinctly to me with the Spottswoode, right? There's just some more flavor components in there that would lead me to believe that there were additional grapes. Whereas I think the other two wines read, pretty Cabernet to my palate.
Yeah.
Alder, what do you find from south to north? I just like your opinion from a purely, objective standpoint. I'd be interested.
Sure. I don't necessarily, I wouldn't say that I agreed entirely with Allison, that, it felt warmer as we went north. And it may be just this wonderful blend of the two hillsides that Priyanka gets, because I get this really nice balance between sort of the brighter red fruits, but also some darker components, some more blackberry and cassis going on in the Padrone, which I'll pronounce now that correctly, that I've been shamed into pronouncing right by some of our chat panelists. So for me, this wine is got this really nice sort of duality between darker fruits and brighter fruits. Whereas with the textbook, again, to Jonathan's slightly earlier picking, I get more of that sort of just pure, bright cherry fruit. And then, that for me is a, textbook, if you'll forgive the pun, Napa Valley Floor Cabernet. And then with the Spottswoode, I'm getting more of that sort of spice box, and there's just something that feels like a fabric with different kinds of warps and wefts to it that leads me to believe that there are different types of grapes in this wine, that it's maybe not as easy to compare to the other two that are dominated by Cabernet in quite the same way. I don't know if that answers your question, Beth.
No, that does help. Thank you. I just think it's good to have it come from you. And Connor has asked us to sort of look at the Q&A. So Alder, there's been questions about the fires and how we're, what is the issue with smoke, and how are we addressing it? And then we'll get right up to the mountains, because we have just 30 minutes. But for us, we've did some micro ferments out of our estate on the 28th of August. We're sending those samples to the AWRI, the Australian Wine Research Institute, and having them take a good look, because what Aaron Weinkauf, I am not the winemaker here, Aaron Weinkauf is our winemaker and vineyard manager, and what he is, ETS will measure, but they really only measure volatiles, and Aaron really wants sort of what's bound up in the fruit, and he wants the glycosides. So we've sent some samples that we microfermented in late August to Australia, and then we're sending some up to something called Supra Labs in British Columbia. And so our harvest plan is we're going to go forward with harvest. We have had smoke in our valley. We have smoke here today. And so we have had smoke, which is something that we haven't contended with. We have contended with fires, but not as much smoke in our valley, and certainly not at this time when we're sort of going into harvest. But we're going to go forward and pick our vineyard. I think we're going to be bringing in a little bit of cab early next week, and we'll keep bringing it in after that. And we're going to go forward as if everything is fine, and we'll figure it out as we go along, because we won't get results back for about a month. So we are probably 3 weeks away from results. So we just have to go forward, pick the fruit, make the wine, and then make those determinations. So as yet, we're still learning about this. This is still very new to us.
Yeah. And I haven't ignored, well, I have been ignoring the questions about fires and smoke in the comments because I didn't want this to devolve into, oh my God, it's burning down conversation and how's everybody doing? Because we could talk for a while about these obviously nervous times that we're having. But since you started the conversation, Beth, yeah, folks chime in. I know Allison, you were saying something before we got started just about, the fact that the Hess Collection didn't make wine at all in 2017 because of the fires, but
Yeah.
that's not true this year. So
That's not true this year. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that every one of these events is very different and has different origins and sort of a different dynamic to it. And I think what we obviously saw in 2017 was far more extreme for us. At our winery, we were surrounded by the Partridge fire on three sides. And it was pretty inescapable at that point in time. So we didn't actually make we didn't make any wine in 2017 from our Mount Veeder vineyards because it would have been pointless. We're not in that situation today. We have sent out quite a few samples. We are monitoring things carefully. And the results that we've started getting back, we're pretty cautiously optimistic about this vintage in 2020. I think you have to be, careful and conscientious about how you move forward. But right now, what we're seeing looks pretty good. So I'm still as excited about harvest as I was a few months ago. So we'll hope that carries through.
that's great.
Hey, Alder, if I could just add something to that, I echo what Allison says, cautiously optimistic. And I think if you look particularly at the folks who are on this panel here, there is a long history of these wineries, high degree of integrity, and a real interest in preserving the caliber of their wine quality and their brand name. And many, like Allison, make very difficult decisions to not make a harvest. And I think we're all prepared in some way, shape, or form to do that, but it's just too early to tell right now.
Sure.
I agree with everything. The way I think, looking at it, we've done some of the micro ferments. All of our whites are already in, most of them close to finishing primary fermentation at this point. And so far, things look promising, which kind of keeps you going at the next step forward. This by no means is an experience limited to just this year. I mean, we're on the 5th year running now of Northern California being impacted. So I think in the long run, this is going to be an extremely educational year for everyone involved. People are looking at what are the different strategies in terms of, as a winemaker, what can we do to inhibit or to impact or to express fruit further, and what will be the actual impact from this. But it's such a difficult factor to model. And most importantly, it's been extremely different from the 17 fires, both in terms of proximity, the quality of smoke, the amount of exposure. There's so many different aspects that ultimately result in smoke taint or whatever the impact may be. But so far, I like what Allison said, cautiously optimistic, and the show must go on. Absolutely.
Good. Well, let's jump back to our terroirs here, and Riley, feel free to chime in with your point of view on smoke and fires as we get started here. But so now we're leaving St. Helena. We're just going uphill, basically 5 miles up into the Spring Mountain. But it might as well be a little bit of a different universe, right? So we've left the valley floor and now we're in mountainside fruit. So tell us a little bit about what mountainside means to you, how it's different from your neighbors down on the valley floor, and the specific site that you've got there on Spring Mountain, Riley.
Yeah, thanks, Alder. So yeah, Spring Mountain is a pretty cool place. I guess literally, it happens to be the coolest climate, I think, within Napa. We were established, the AVA itself was established in '93, so somewhat recently. It's one of the smaller ones as well. So I think we have less than 1,000 acres planted up here, distributed evenly among sort of about 30 producers, I think is where we sit. The cooling influence is actually a really cool process. I think surprisingly, we're only about 30 miles to the east of the Pacific Ocean. And that has a daily effect on our climate here as a result of mostly the hotter inland climate creating this very large low pressure system that then drags in these cooler air elements from the coast. And because we literally are sort of the lowest point of elevation in the northern part of the Mayacamas, we have Diamond Mountain to our north, and then we have Bald Mountain, which I guess is closer to the Mount Veeder AVA area, both of which are higher than the Spring Mountain AVA. So we have this sort of lower depression that creates this nice little funnel that these cool airs are dragged through, usually at night and or during the day as well, which keeps us, you see, if we're about 100 degrees in St. Helena, you can come up the hill and come to our front door and we're at about 90. So the difference is pretty significant and has a lot to do with our style up here. The soils are pretty easy to remember on Spring Mountain because they're almost an even distribution between, you sort of have your Franciscan alluvial elements, which is I guess mostly sandstone up here. And then you have your volcanic outcroppings that you see all over our vineyards up here, which are mostly andesite. As you have our Diamond Mountain, which is mostly volcanic to our north, and then Mount Veeder, where you have a lot of alluvial soils to our south. So we're sort of sandwiched in between, which is really cool. Great drainage, great stress. The soils are fairly depleted, so there's a lot of struggling up here, which is great. Go ahead.
Oh, I don't know if you know, but you know you've identified that gap between Mayacamas and Mount Veeder and the Mayacamas and Diamond Mountain and the degree to which that can suck in sort of a marine influence there. Talk also about your awareness and understanding of just the proximity of the forest around you and the fact that you've got a lot of trees around you. Are there shade influences? Are there little pockets of cool air that get trapped by the forest there that affect?
So Spring Mountain is interesting. It's primarily thought of as an eastern exposed AVA, and I think for most of the primary producing vineyards up here, that's the case, although it is highly variable. And just for us, for instance, most of our exposure is primarily southeastern, but we have distinct vineyard locations nestled within this range that also see northern exposure and confusingly western exposure. So we have single vineyard Merlots that we do that stare directly back into the mountain range essentially. And the only reason these work is because there's so many water systems up here that occur naturally throughout the year that have caused erosion over thousands and thousands of years that have sort of created a nice little clearance in between these sort of weird exposed panels that we use for vineyards and the rest of the mountain, where you wouldn't think there'd be enough space for the sun to sit on it long enough, but that just it isn't the case up here. It's really interesting. So yeah, I forgot your question.
Oh, I was just talking about the forest influence and the proximity of trees, and
that's other than the amazing beauty. There are some downsides. So it keeps us cool up here, which is primarily upside. But our proximity to a lot of these riparian corridors up here does lend itself to higher humidity, which is an issue with occasionally with mildew up here. And there's also more vectors up here for some of the stuff we don't want, like glassy winged sharpshooters. Phylloxera, things like that seem to proliferate up here with a little bit more often. So those are things that we always have to think about. Shade isn't necessarily an issue. We were lucky enough to establish these vineyards long ago enough where we could create enough clearance without the hassle from the county. That's rarely an issue for us up here. And then rain is the other main factor. We get more rain than anywhere else in the valley by a significant degree. So erosion is always something that we're very aware of and on top of. But that also leads to some upside for us. We're 100% dry farmed and haven't irrigated our vineyards in over 20 years, which is usually catches people by surprise, given the mountain site and the depleted soils and the great drainage we get. We still get away with dry farming. It's great. We love it. And then quickly about the wine, this is our reserve cab, which is primarily from our southeastern exposed vineyards, mostly clones 7, 412, and 337 for this vintage, although that cuvee tends to change depending on what we're tasting out of the cellar. And then this also has a larger component of estate cab franc than I think it typically does, which I think sort of emphasizes our core style, which is this very lifted, very pretty, very floral, very restrained sort of approach, especially to Cabernet. I think when people come up into the mountains, they just assume it's going to be about power and tannin. And that certainly isn't the case for our style. And I think a lot of our neighbors also sort of approach Cabernet with a sort of a much more pretty approach. And I also think that also is the result of the pre-phylloxera era of Keenan versus the post, where our rootstock completely changed from AXR to 110 and 140, which I think is a responsible in large part to the change in tannin quality we started getting from the vines up here. It's a little bit more rounded and integrated at a younger age. It's a little bit more under control than it used to be in my grandfather's era. So it's interesting to see that change.
And so is that a lower vigor stock?
Yeah, no, it's actually higher vigor and drought resistant is what we went for here.
Got it. And is the Cabernet Franc responsible for that really lovely little green herbal note that I'm getting in this wine, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. And then sometimes I attribute that, depending on how long it's been open, it becomes a little bit more violet and sort of lavender quality we get from the estate up here. And that's our highest vineyard, is about 2,000 feet facing northwest is our Cabernet Franc. The last thing we always harvest, occasionally that drags on into November on cooler years. So yeah, we get some good balance of vegetality and savoriness from that block too.
Yeah, no, it's a really nice balance to that bright hillside fruit. So it's funny, we're going to now jump all the way back to the south end of the valley, but sort of stay up in the hills to talk with Allison about the Hess Collection and Mount Veeder. And what's interesting, and the reason that we've done it in this way, is because I think we'll find you have an awful lot more in common with the sort of the world that Riley was just talking about necessarily than the valley floor of these other producers. So tell us a little about Mount Veeder and what you've got going up there in terms of the site that this Cabernet would be coming from.
Right. So, Mount Veeder, first of all, Alder, you're exactly right. I have a lot more in common, I think, with some of Riley's challenges and some of the growing areas in the vineyards that I've seen on Spring Mountain. Mount Veeder is one of the mountain AVAs of Napa, and we're actually the furthest south. So we are the closest to the San Pablo Bay, but we also kind of pull in some of the Pacific air through the Petaluma Gap and kind of over our mountains. So just like further up valley at Spring Mountain, we can typically be 10 to 12 degrees cooler up on the mountain in the summertime than down on the valley floor, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people. So what does it sort of mean for us? Well, it means that our buds break a little bit later in the year. It means that we get a slightly slower start to the growing season. But because of our elevation up on Mount Veeder, we have vineyards that kind of crust the top of 4 different ridges up on Mount Veeder. We are able to stay above the fog line for much of the summer as well. So we kind of catch up throughout the year. But there's no denying Mount Veeder's pretty cool, and we will definitely be bringing up the rear when it comes to harvest this year. So I guarantee you I will still be harvesting in November this year. There's no question. But I think the important things to keep in mind about Mount Veeder is when you look at a map, like when you just look at the map of the AVAs or the sub-AVAs of the Napa Valley, Mount Veeder looks enormous, right? It's like 25 square miles of space, but there's only about 1,000 acres planted in that large area on the map. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. The topography is so varied. The slopes are so steep. The valleys are so deep and shaded that really you do have to kind of intentionally farm the sun in the Mount Veeder AVA by being up on the ridge tops, hopefully being in a more southerly, easterly, or west-facing aspect. And you kind of have to pay attention to all of those things. Elevation brings with it changes in temperature, like we discussed. It brings about change in soil depth, which I think is really important when you're talking about Mount Veeder wines. Usually our soil depth is, only 12 to 24 inches maybe, because, gravity works. At the top of your mountains, you're going to have very thin soils. As you go further down the hills and into the benches and into the river valley, of course, the soils get a lot deeper. And what does that actually, what do those things actually mean for our wines? They translate like this. Cooler temperatures can help us hang on to both more color and more aroma, and shallower soil depth also means that our natural average yields are quite low, maybe only in the 2 to 2.5 ton to the acre at like a good year. So it's not because we're not planting a lot, or it's not because we don't have a lot of vineyards planted. It's just that the berry size tends to be smaller because of those thinner soils. And that translates into more concentration. I like to think more depth in the wine. But it can also translate into a little bit more tannin strength in the wine. So I think hillside wines tend to be a little bit more muscular and big boned in a way. And so we have to sort of carefully plan the way that we harvest each year, because each year is going to give us something different. The blocks that worked for us last year, if it was cooler last year, this year, because it might be a little bit warmer, we might look for different blocks to get our reserve fruit out of this year. So you have to kind of keep all of those three dimensions in mind as you approach the coming harvest. So that's Mount Veeder in a nutshell.
Great, Allison. And there's a question that's come in directly for you, which is somebody who's had the Alomi Cabernet, Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir, and they're wondering, wow, how do you grow all three of those in the same vineyard?
You know, that's a great question, and I'll be the first to admit we do not actually grow them all in the same vineyard. Our Alomi home ranch, that is up on a vineyard that's kind of on the backside of Howell Mountain. It's a very warm climate up in the northeastern part of the county. Our Pinot Noir and our Chardonnay are grown in Carneros. So they are siblings to the Alomi Cabernet, but I suppose you could grow them in the same vineyard, but we just wouldn't be doing ourselves or our loyal, folks and fans out in the world any favors if we tried to grow Pinot and Chardonnay and Cabernet in the same vineyard. So we've searched for the best locations for each of those varietals.
And at this point, Alomi is more of a brand than a specific site.
It is. The Cabernet still all comes from the Alomi vineyard, absolutely. But we have expanded the brand to encompass a few more varietals. That's correct. Yeah.
Great. So we've now gone through everybody's wines, and let's do the same thing here and talk a little bit about the hillside wines versus the valley floor wines. I'm interested in your perspectives on these, but as we do that, Riley, I was quite curious about soil depth that Allison was talking about. Do you have a sense of your soil depths on Spring Mountain and how those compare to Mount Veeder?
Yeah, I think it's very variable. And if our property is any example, we, like in our Point Vineyard where we grow some Zin, some Alicante, some Carignan, and some Cab, there are spots in that plot that look like there's less than a foot. Maybe it's 6 inches. I don't know that. I mean, if I ever have kids, the way to punish them is just go send them there and tell them to dig a hole. It'll take them all day to get anywhere. And then we have our small block of single vineyard Chardonnay that we do, which is probably the deepest soils on the property. If we had to guess, maybe up to 10 feet in some spots. So it depends on where you are, how close you are to a riparian corridor versus sort of an eastern outcropping where it gets thinner and shallower. But yeah, it's very variable, and it definitely matters because it depends on what you're going to plant. The Chardonnay would not survive out in the Point. Whereas the Zin would probably be too happy where we're growing Chardonnay. But yeah, that's part of what's fun here. When we installed solar panels here, they're all on large, 15 steel bollards outside. And the company that came here to dig and install them said that they've never struggled harder to dig and install stuff.
Yes, my heart goes out to those guys for sure. Whenever they're trying to dig anything on the mountainsides. But about these two wines, people talk an awful lot about Hillside Tannins. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at in the context of these two wines, because I think while they're sort of different stylistically, I'd say the Keenan is maybe picked a little earlier and is a little lighter in style versus the Hess being richer and darker and riper. There's definitely a through line with the texture of the tannins in these two wines. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
Yeah, Alder, this is John. was really pleasantly surprised with particularly the tannin profile of the Keenan and the Hess. Years back, I worked a lot up on Diamond Mountain, and I remember just these gripping, super hard, angry tannins. And congrats to both Allison and Riley on really managing them. And that's particularly something I look at for my textbook wines is quality of tannin. And I'm really pleasantly surprised. So bravo, guys, love them.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I was thinking about this a lot, and I wish I had something more I wish I had a stronger conclusion to say about this, because I think for Keenan at least, there's definitely two eras, and anyone who drank my grandfather's wines know what those wines did to your mouth and your palate. They were aggressive, just like John was saying. And I think that was the point. He really wanted to make an angry wine that was going to outlive him. And in some regard, he succeeded. But I think now with modern winemaking, what consumers are expecting on the shelf, it's just not, it wasn't tenable. And in this post-phylloxera rootstock era that I think my dad now exists in, we've embraced, and by necessity and by choice, this finer, rounder, more integrated tannin, which we're thrilled to have access to, because I'm not sure that I want to build the bulletproof wines that my grandfather was making. But it seems interesting that the mountain is certainly capable of producing both, depending on what your intentions are.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to keep sort of the soul of those hillside vineyards in their flavor, their aroma, their color. But to Riley's point, to Jonathan's point, wine should be a pleasurable experience. We want to have something that is deeply satisfying and rich and luscious and kind of takes us out of our everyday. And it's kind of hard to do that if you feel like you're, if you have to be a masochist to get through some really hard tannins.
You're scraping stuff off your teeth.
Yeah, so I think, the main goal in hillside farming, and I've worked with every mountain AVA in the Napa Valley and got my winemaking degree in Germany. So somehow I got lost in the hills. I've just never left. But you really do have to learn how to live with and read your mountain vineyards and really understand what they go through each year and why they are so different each year in order to try to achieve the best balance and richness that you can out of these mountain vineyards. And it's fun. It's like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle every year, right? I want to just say too that that's not different for any winemaker. Every winemaker anywhere with any slope and any differing soil types has that same sort of puzzle, take on their vintage each year. But for us, it just kind of works its way through more extremes sometimes, and it's a lot of fun.
Would you say that work in the vineyard or work in the cellar has been contributed more to sort of that tannin management over time and sort of the moving toward, away from those angry wines of the past, Riley, and towards sort of more plush, more accessible tannins these days?
I would say it's definitely the case that it's both, but I'd say that the cellar management is more of a reaction of what we're seeing come in from the vineyards. So I'd say that the vineyards and what we're doing there is definitely driving the bus in terms of finding more of a rich tannin balance, and then reacting to what we're seeing in the cellar to embrace and focus on that, I think is the way that I would.
Specific techniques out there in the vineyard that you're doing, whether it's leafing or dropping fruit or canopy management? Like what is it that you're using to manage the tannins better?
Well, I think the soil is a little bit healthier than it used to be. It's not quite as depleted. We're doing a little bit more amendments for nitrogen, for example, and a lot more top crop growing with legumes and stuff like that. And then as far as crop thinning, we usually practice none of that except for certain years. So I think with the yields that we've sort of found a balance with, the fruit that comes in doesn't have that extra layer of aggression that it might if we were targeting 2 tons an acre, for example. We found that some of our favorite vintages with the best balance and follow through and lift come from 4 or 5 tons an acre up here on the hillsides, which we get with some regularity.
Allison?
Yeah, I think we have both, right? We have, we've kind of recognized again, sort of where that, where the target or the goal is really, the highest expression of the vineyard, but in a real pleasurable, supple package. And so the idea is that we want to farm our grapes, just like, any vineyard, any winemaker has this as their goal. We are searching to pick at the peak of ripeness, not a little bit too early, not a little bit too late, and raisiny. We want to really preserve that incredible height of ripeness that gives you the most pure and clear and ringing fruit. And as far as the tannins are concerned, I think we have multiple challenges in the Mount Veeder appellation. We have multiple challenges on our 4 ridge lines. Some of that is, sometimes too much sun, right? So for those blocks, we are actively either looking at, we are replanting up here right now. And so we're looking at really dialing in our row orientation to be a little bit more protective of our fruit. But you can't replant everything, every year. So in those areas where we're not able to replant just yet, we're using and testing out different kinds of shade cloth, 30%, 50% shade, just to make sure that we don't get too much sun exposure. And then of course, there's other parts of our vineyards where they might be north facing slopes, or they might be sort of, I call them amphitheaters, right? They're kind of like these sort of deep, almost funnels down into the mountain. And honestly, they're not maybe the best spot for Cabernet up on the hill. And so we grow a lot of other varietals up here. We grow a great, minerally beautiful Chardonnay. It's really rare to find Hillside Chardonnay these days anymore. We grow a little bit of Gruner Veltliner. We grow some Albarino. We have some Merlot up here and a few other varietals as well. So we try to target this site to the right varietal and make sure that we're achieving the best that can be grown in that particular plot of land. So there's adjustment in the vineyard, and then of course there's also adjustment in the winery. We kind of had this strange tragedy / gift of the 2014 earthquake, and we're so blessed that nobody was hurt during that earthquake, but it did damage our winery quite a bit. We lost about 50,000 gallons worth of wine, and it was a humbling experience at the hands of Mother Nature, but it allowed us to actually completely revamp our winery. And so now we've put in smaller tanks that are, 1.5 and 3 ton fermenters that are really ideally situated to bring in just the tiny blocks that we grow on the mountain, or just the east side of the tiny, of some of the tinier ridgelines that we grow up here. So it's a combination of both to really be able to target where your ripeness is on any given day and pick just that part, and ferment it separately and give it the kid glove treatment every day.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're coming up on an hour here, and so I'd like to ask a question that's sort of been implicit in the conception of this seminar, and get your opinions as both individuals and as winemakers in Napa, which is that, do the different AVAs of Napa have a taste? And let's maybe limit our conversation here to Cabernet, but is there something that you can taste that's the same in St. Helena Cabernet, that's different than Oakville Cabernet, that's different than Oak Knoll Cabernet? Is there enough of a similarity of that spot within Napa that you can tell those wines are from the same place or not? What do you guys think? Go ahead, Priyanka.
Should I go ahead? Okay.
Yeah.
I think there is, and it takes a little bit to get to know the producers, because we are seeing kind of an increase in terms of what the winemakers are starting to do with their properties. I feel like this focus on estate winemaking is starting to get really highlighted in Napa Valley. And because of that, we're really starting to see authentic stories and authentic wines come out of these properties. But at the same time, from like an appellation point of view, for me, I worked in Oakville previously, and for me, blueberries and like a blue fruit character with violet was a very Oakville fruit component. Whereas with Stag's Leap, the texture of the tannins was a thing. Rutherford dust, I think the minute you start really getting into Napa Valley, you will hear that term right away. I find Oak Knoll tends to be definitely more on that red fruit spectrum, a lot more of that strawberry and brighter cherry characters. And so, yeah, I think there's a reason these appellations have been created, and they do highlight kind of these microclimates that we see as we go through the valley. And then, of course, there's all of the winemakers and producers that do the best to highlight what they can out of their specific property as well.
Mm-hmm. Beth, what do you think?
My feeling is that even within each appellation, there's the east side and the west side of each of these valley floor appellations. And those are they're extremely different. I mean, the west side of St. Helena and our benchland is quite different than, say, where Jeff Smith is with Hourglass, right at that really narrow pinch point. And then, or you think of the Crane Vineyard, and you think of the Stantons over on Dowdell closer, or the Crocker Star Winery, right? Which is, so it's such a fascinating thing. I mean, Alder, you touched on it right at the beginning, but when you look at Napa Valley, I mean, the Vintners has this amazing map, and hopefully, you can't see it all here, but when you look at this is just all the appellations of Napa Valley, but you look at the two mountain ranges and you look at the variation on each side, that, to say, I mean, I can speak to what Spottswoode generally tastes like. Obviously, I have a little experience with it, but, to say that there's, you can, depending on what you choose to do, and Allison touched on this, when you choose to pick, are you picking it past its ripeness? Are you picking it at perfect ripeness? Are you doing, there's so many different ways it can taste. So I think it would be difficult to taste a lot of wines blind and say, well, that's clearly St. Helena appellation, that's clearly Rutherford appellation, that's clearly, it might be easier to say that's benchland, feels like it's sort of, maybe that's Western benchland in the Rutherford, St. Helena area type of a thing. But I think to really pinpoint that is a teeny bit challenging, and it does come down to producer as well. And yet, there certainly is a difference. I mean, if you taste Stag's Leap and you get those beautiful strawberries, that real freshness, and there's just a lot of things that are sort of typical to regions. So if a person makes wines toward that typicity in a sense, then I think you can capture it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jonathan, you've farmed a lot of different spots throughout the valley in your career. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I like what Priyanka said about Oakville, because the textbook, of course, is from there, that notion of blueberry. When I look around at my neighbors, I do see that family of blueberry as a common thread. But, it's like having kids, right? If you have 5 kids, they're all in the same family, but they each have their own little nuances, right? And then you add into it the human element, it can affect that. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because again, if you look at other great Cabernet areas around the world, particularly Bordeaux, if you went into Saint Estèphe, there's going to be a family of themes there, but within that there will be different nuances, and I'm pretty comfortable with that. It's part of the excitement of making wines in Oakville and with folks that are on this call.
Mm-hmm. Riley, somebody's asked a question I think is particularly useful to ask you as a young third generation, working in a winery. How long does it take to get to know a vineyard? How long does it take you to truly understand a site before you feel like you've got a grip on it?
3 generations exactly.
So you've got it made.
No, it takes years, as we all are dramatically aware of. We do this whole thing once a year, and so the process is slow and tedious, but ultimately really rewarding. For me, I've barely even scratched the surface. I'm glad you're not putting the pressure on me to answer the question about the AVAs, because I just feel like I'm not even close to having the right amount of experience to speak credibly on that. And I feel the same way about even our vineyards up here. It's still absolutely ongoing. I'm very annoying to our office staff over there, because I'm always mining them for information. So I say maybe the short answer to your question is you really don't ever get there. There's always ways to progress and improve, and keeping an open mind about that is really the key, I think.
Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. Priyanka, you're also in the position of being relatively new, working with the Signorello site that you're at. What's your learning curve been like?
Oh, huge. I mean, as I mentioned, we unfortunately lost a lot of that historic data that, really tells you a lot about just the vineyard blocks. And we have a number of different combinations in terms of rootstocks and clones. And so it has been a huge learning experience for us to come in and, kind of start almost from scratch. But for vineyards that are over, our Chardonnay vineyard was planted in 1980. So, it's been around longer than I have in Napa Valley, and all of our cab is from 1990. So to try and understand the nuances of each block has taken a lot of work. But, Allison mentioned this, and I agree wholeheartedly. When you look at a property, and especially when you have, more of like that mountain influence, and even in the valley floor, because you can change so much from a soil composition from one point to the other, that you really kind of have to look at it more on a micro level, if you will. And so we have started this concept of more precision viticulture, where we're looking at really each plant and each vine and trying to balance that within itself. So when you're in an older vineyard, you have all your original vines, but then you have some younger ones that are spot replants. And so how do you make sure you're taking each plant to that final level? And that takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of attention to detail, and as sometimes 5 rows are ready to pick and 6 rows are not, and I think that attention to detail, things like that, is really what creates those nuances and creates those subtle differences between all the wines. And we've already tasted 5 amazing examples of what everyone's decision can do for the end wine result, and I'm excited for Napa Valley as a whole to keep showcasing that in the future.
Yeah. What about ageability? Somebody's asked about ageability. Is there a difference in the ageability of different regions of Napa? My personal experience is that it has much more to do with the individual wine and the the style of the estate than a particular region within Napa. But I'm curious as to you panelists, your thoughts on that.
I agree with you, Alder. I think it depends on what somebody's attempting to achieve. I mean, our first vintage was 1982, and obviously it's bottle by bottle, but we've recorked all those, and that wine is still showing some of that beauty. That was 100% Cab. We didn't have Cabernet Franc at that time, and then we added Petit Verdot later. But I think ageability is about how the wine is built. When you pick the fruit, what is the balance? What is the acidity? And what were you looking to sort of achieve at that time? But I think it comes down to balance and having all those pieces in order, so that over time that finely honed, finely made wine continues to grow together, if you will, as opposed to having different pieces of it sticking out that kind of make themselves a little bit more apparent. Down the road, it can continue to be this sort of holistic expression of a wine, and can age beautifully with that. But I do think it has, I mean, certainly tannin is a part of that, but also other acids and just the balance of the wine. Because I think, as Riley alluded to, I mean, if you make these big monster, highly tannic wines, it is hard for them to ever really open up into some beauty. I think Randy Dunn used to do, the same thing, right? And they were always known for that. We still have some old Dunns in our cellar, and they're absolutely fascinating. And do they ever, you're sort of like, okay, is this going to come along? Is it going to come along? Because it's so, in a way, so high in that one type of tannin, and the other parts aren't there. So they hold, but it's fascinating. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add something. I'm really glad that Beth brought up acidity as part of the ageability equation, because oftentimes we think about tannin as being the hallmark of whether or not a wine is ageable. And I think I haven't really run across a Cabernet from Napa Valley that is lacking in tannin. I mean, we have it in spades. We have all different kinds of qualities of tannin. There's velvety, there's voluptuous, there's harder, firmer, tighter. I mean, we have all kinds of descriptors for it, but acidity is a really important part of ageability. And without it, I think, more so than the vintner, more so than even the site, ageability is determined very often by the vintage. I know there's some beautiful vintages out there that I have personally enjoyed so much, but they have been early ripening vintages and they have been really exciting right out of the gate. And, after a few years, they can be they can be just not quite as attractive as they were in their first blush. And so I think having that acidity, having a balance, I mean, that's one of the reasons why you'll hear winemakers just talk about wanting to have that beautiful growing season without, too many heat spikes, but, it's warm enough to get everything ripe, the Cinderella vintage. That's really what we're always in search of. And that's part of the equation, because we know that that is what is going to help our vineyards really express themselves for a really, really, really long time, probably longer than some of us are going to be around. So there you go. It's a constant journey and a constant sort of chase in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
if I could just to emphasize Allison's point, I think a good example for anyone wondering, like a concrete example of the past of what Allison's talking about, is the 97 and the 98 vintage in Napa. I think sort of embody exactly what she was saying. 97, hot, plush, tasty right out of the gate. All the critics were fawning over it. And now we've totally seen this reversal. I've had producers where that wine is completely fallen apart. And whereas the 98 for some people is just one of the most extraordinary wines of the decade, in my opinion. So I think that's what Allison was sort of talking about there.
Yeah, no, great example. I was going to bring up 98 as well.
You read my mind, Riley.
Priyanka, it looked like you were trying to get a word in there.
Well, I just wanted to say, I think with ageability, we're just starting to learn about it, because with Napa being a younger wine region, I don't think that we've given as much emphasis to older Napa wines as we should. And for me, I've only just started my journey into older Napa cabs, but some of the early 80s, the 90s, I mean, we had a 90s Keenan just last week that was absolutely singing. And so I think that, ageability has been something that older wine regions have talked about, but they also have a lot of experience because they're going through all these vintages. And I really hope that in the future with Napa, we'll start to highlight the ageability of Napa wines, because as she said, I mean, I agree completely with Allison about vintage being a huge force behind what the ageability of the wine will be like, but as well as there are some producers that have really kind of nailed that in many ways. And we've done verticals with a couple of different producers, and each one of them has been really stellar in showcasing what that vintage was about. So for me, I would love to see more of a discussion on ageability of Napa Valley wines.
Mm-hmm. We only just have a couple minutes left. Jonathan, you've been quiet for a little while. Why don't we give you the last word on ageability as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think I have less hair and whiter hair than everyone here. And I've been very fortunate to taste wines from around the world, and having made wines now for whatever, 20 years. So it's fascinating because, sometimes in those vintages, let's say 97, right? You kind of get seduced by that velvetyness, that roundness, that plushness, and it's all just soft and gooey and amazing, right? And it's often what you're not doing. Let's pull back a couple of the different things that we can pull back as winemakers. Let's restrain it a little bit. Let's really try to think of nuance, which is sometimes really hard to do in the moment, But again, I love finding those, at the moment off vintages or difficult vintages, and you come back later and you say, holy cow, this is not what I was expecting. It's one of the greatest loves I have of wines like that, from those vintages. So I guess my point was more like, we all have our desires and wants. And sometimes, we want, it's less of what you do than more of what you do. So.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we've used up a good 75 minutes here. In some ways, it feels like this conversation is just getting started. Like there's a lot of stuff we could dive into. but we've run out of time. So I want to thank each of you panelists for sharing your wines today and your thoughts and your experience. It's been a great conversation. Thank you everybody who's been watching. And I think Connor's going to jump back on and wrap it up for us.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Alder, for leading a fantastic discussion. And thank you, all of you winemakers, vintners on the panel. We appreciate your time in this super busy time of year.
Yeah, and nobody lost.
And Beth, Riley, and Jonathan, how big your to-do list is. So thank you so much for being here doing this. And most of all, thank you to everyone who's on the call with us. We appreciate your time, your interest, and most importantly, for supporting Napa Valley Wines. If you hadn't had a chance yet, go to napavintners.com, click the Open the Cellar sale, and go procure, explore, and enjoy the diversity of Napa Valley Cabernet. So thank you all and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Alder.
Thanks, Alder. Cheers.
Thanks, Alder. Thank you very much.
Bye, Connor.
Yeah, thanks, group.
Bye.